I find four different parts. One is about the urgency of what we see around us. Then I briefly treat some basic concepts that we are using in transition research. And then a bit on, let's say, the role of scientists. And then a bit about collaboration with Drift. So on special request, I try to be brief. Urgency, well, I always start off with this one. We do not live in an era of change, but in a change of era. That means we are part of a revolution. I hope you have the same impression. Mostly I compare it with the 19th century, the Industrial Revolution. This is more a digital and a sustainable revolution, but it has some similarities, although also some striking differences. But at least there are many kinds of changes in many areas, and I'm analyzing the nature and the scope of that change. I call it transformative change. That's different from ordinary change. I think we are in between those eras, and then you face chaos. The title of my next book will probably be Celebrate the Chaos and Embrace It, because chaos means that the floor is open for new systems and new ideas. It has actually a dark side and a bright side. I focus presumably on the bright side. A transition cannot go along without chaos. Chaos is a prerequisite for a breakthrough in a transition process. Now, what you see all over the world now, it's in Europe, it's in Russia, it is in Canada, United States, bushfires all over the place, floods. This is a picture from the Netherlands 2 weeks ago. The biggest flood over the last 100 years. Of course, you cannot attribute that 100% to climate change. That would be ridiculous. It is a weather extreme. It's partly natural, but it's reinforced by climate change. We know a bit how that works. The jet streams are what we call meandering. Normally they go with high speeds from west to east, and now they start floating around, and extreme weather patterns can be captured in between those meandering jet streams. So that practically means that we will be faced with longer periods of droughts and other kinds of weather extremes like floods. Anyway, in my new book, I analyze a palette of transitions, 10 different transitions. I think we are in a semi-permanent crisis. That's not necessarily bad. I will show that in a minute. The economic crisis, well, we know that we still produce at the cost of the earth. That brings us to an ecological crisis. We have a faith or democratic crisis, and deep down inside it's in ourselves, a moral crisis. Well, we know about all the disadvantages of the current economic system. We still grow at the cost of, and we spend money that there isn't. So the corona crisis is an example of that. It really uncovers system failures. Most of our systems run on efficiency and the shortest return on investment. And every kind of system that you are building up, which is only built on these values, is highly at risk when there is a disturbance like corona. Nature is different. Nature is much more resilient and adaptive than our systems, so we can learn from nature. The deepest cause of corona is our disbalance between humans and nature. And people always blame China, but I always argue it could have arisen in the Netherlands as well, in our intensive farming industry, where so many people and so many animals are packed together. It is also a similar kind of risk. So the point is, we could have foreseen this. There are what we call black swans, but this was not a black swan. That is something you don't know that you don't know, but this was a blind spot. So something you don't know that you know. So you know it, but you, let's say, do not consciously realize it. So the point is, if we do not change our behavior pattern, we will face another pandemic. That leads me to the ecological crisis. Well, if you borrow resources from the earth and you don't pay back, you run into a crisis. We know that. If we would express that in money terms, it runs up to 35%. So we enter the Anthropocene. We know that various symptoms, climate change, but also loss of biodiversity. Climate change, I started 35 years ago studying it. I was the very first who did his PhD in Europe on the very first integrated climate assessment model. And people don't seem to realize that even half a degree difference would be significant. The difference between still ice at the North Pole or ice-free, for instance. Anyway, you probably know about it. But will we succeed in achieving the climate goals? No, realistically speaking, not. The chance that we will stay below the 1.5 degree target is almost zero. And below 2 degrees still possible, but not in the way that we are making progress now. We are now heading for 3-4 degrees temperature increase, but I think we should fight for every 1/10 of a degree of Celsius. That is, I think, because the next 10 years will be decisive, that is the biggest challenge for the next 10 years, to fight for every 1/10 of a degree. Deep down, the crisis in ourselves. It's in our consumption behavior and our production behavior. It's a part of us is egoistic and greedy. We need to acknowledge that, and that should bring us further, at least. So what I expect is a series, a concatenation of crises. After COVID-19 and its recession, there will be a climate crisis, which is way bigger than the COVID-19 crisis, and then the nature crisis. Before you think I'm pessimistic, I think that we will stumble from one crisis to the other in the coming decades, but that these crises are basically a blessing in disguise. We are stubborn. 90% of our behavior is ordinary behavior, is routine-based behavior. So people mostly change under crisis. So what we see as a kind of a pattern after each systemic crisis like this one is that a small group of people will change its behavior 5-10%, and the rest is going to business as usual. But it counts up. It is a kind of an, let's say, accumulative process. So we need a series of crises, and not until you reach 50% of the people, but 25% of the people. So we have now the empirical research in our hands that show that 25% of the population is the tipping point. It's a highly non-linear process. So if you reach that, the remaining 75% might go relatively fast. That's a relative notion that might take another generation. But anyway, my assumption is that we are now in between 15 and 20%. If you look roughly globally, at least in Europe, we take that as a kind of an indication. So we don't need ordinary change. Ordinary change is that you do things efficiently and cheaper and smarter, but we need radical change, systemic change. Well, that brings me to the second part, transitions. Well, basically a transition is a fundamental shift in the way we think, act, and organize. That's much more easily said than done in practice. In particular, changing our thinking. You cannot force people to change their thinking, so that's something that should come from internal, and it's basically rooted in the values and paradigms that people have. It is embedded in the acting and it is embedded in the organizing, but okay, I have distributed this in systemic terms. we denote a transition and a fundamental change in the structure of a system, the culture and the practices. They're also embedded. But look at the energy system. We need to build up a completely different physical, economic and institutional infrastructure. We need to change our collective set of values and norms, how we think about energy, and also to change our day-to-day routines. Well, that is why a transition takes time, usually at least 1 or 2 generations, because there's a lot of resistance from people. It's also a shift in power. Our research is based on 3 pillars: complex system science. I'm a trained mathematician, so I'm quite familiar with complex system science. That has given me quite a few insights in how complex systems work. Social theory, in particular, impacted by the work of Anthony Giddens and Ulrich Beck and people like that. The eternal duality between agency and systems, and the governance theory, how to govern it. When I started with transitions 25 years ago, there was hardly any attention. And if there was focus on the energy transition. Now it is all over the place. Any kind of system you take into account is in a certain stage of transition. Finance, food, mobility, healthcare, education. I've seen the shift over the years from the hardware to the software. There's now much more focus in Europe on education, healthcare, the social innovation part of it. If you look at the drivers, people always go back to economic and technological drivers for good reasons, but they underrate the potential impact of the societal pressure that comes from groups of people and consumer behavior. More and more I have come across that social norms can be quite important in order to drive a transition. Anyway, it's a whole palette, and most people focus only on the hardware, the economic and technological part of it. Yeah, we did quite a lot of research into power shifts. So in our transition language, we speak of a regime that has the power, that has a dominant structure, culture, and practices. And there are niches that are emerging and want to get that power. And there's always a fight between those who have the power and those who want to become in power. And that's not the same as the bad guys and the good guys, because if the niches get the power and form a regime, then later on emerging niches, they resist against their, let's say, successors. So that's the evolutionary dimension of the revolutionary part of a transition. Can you govern that? No, not really. Not really in terms of command and control. That's too ambitious. But you can at least try to influence transitions, at least the pace of a transition and a direction. Already long ago, we developed transition management, which is an oxymoron, but we call it now governance. It's more influencing. You can try to stimulate radical innovation, because mostly the focus is on incremental innovation. Try to remove barriers, legally, for instance, but also informal barriers, challenge the market and mobilize society, and always combine the long-term thinking and short-term action. So we came up with this wheel. It's a kind of a cycle. We speak of, let's say, a cyclical process. It's more a spiraling process. So we create spaces for radical innovation. We call them transition arenas. In those arenas with frontrunners and connectors, we focus on a long-term vision, a variety of pathways from now to the vision, and a transition agenda. So that means all kind of interventions to stimulate the pathways. Then you start with a palette of experiments, learn from that, try to arrange money, because you need quite a lot of money for these experiments, and then go back to your vision, adjust that pathway. So that is the evolutionary part of it. Well, we have applied it in more than 20 countries and 50 cities all over the world, from Europe, US, Australia, till even Africa. There's a rich amount of literature within Drift. Have we been successful? Sometimes. We have a lot of failures also. We are proud of that. We learned most from our failures. We are also applying it in our hometown of Rotterdam for quite a number of years. So what we do is the city is centered around the biggest port in Europe. And that is for our city remarkable. We have 650,000 people. And that is a town rather than a city seen from China. China has more than 100 cities of above 1 million people. So the center of the city consists of the old ports that you see here. And we are transforming these old harbor areas into, well, sustainable neighborhoods. So the old buildings, we are transforming into what we call maker districts, trying to attract entrepreneurs and let's say startups and scale-ups, and step by step it's growing into that direction. We started with building on the water because of the rising sea level. We need to experiment with floating elements like swimming pools, houses, markets, whatever, in order to build up a new relationship with the water. Well, that's all fascinating. We are using some transition lenses. I will show some, but try to keep it brief. There's a whole bunch of literature behind it. Well, we have the so-called S-curve. That means two things. A transition is a highly nonlinear process, and it has at least three phases: the pre-development phase, the tipping point phase. I think in the energy transition, we are in a tipping point phase characterized by chaos, lots of protests, lawsuits all over the place, and the true development phase. Well, it's a stylized version, and it is also a successful one. Most transitions fail. They run into a lock-in or even an overshoot collapse that you end up with, let's say, a worse situation than you started with. But this is the stylized version. In reality, it's a more whimsical process because of all the resistance that you'll come across underway. Applied to the energy transition, well, I think we are in between the fossil fuel and the renewables era. It's from fossil fuel to renewables, but not only that, it's from a more centralized to decentralized energy system, and from top down to bottom up. We have now developed the X curve. You see the S curve here, building up, let's say, project experiments. But what you also need to do is breaking down things, breaking down laws, rules, or stand in the way, institutions, norms. So although they do not run in a parallel mode, it's a combination of breaking down things and building up. This is the multi-scale lens, so there are at least 3 different scale levels. Although it's more a continuum, it's difficult to handle conceptually. There's fast dynamics at the micro level, slow dynamics at the macro level, and in between we try to influence it at the meso level. So if you apply that for energy, you see fast dynamics by all kinds of entrepreneurs. If you see a plus, then it reinforces the energy transition. If you see a minus, then it hinders the transition. Well, when I started this 20 years ago, there were only minuses. So we were at the early pre-development stage. Now there are more and more pluses. At the micro level, the most. There's an abundance of startups, scale-ups, front runners, the breakthrough of solar and wind energy. At the macro level, it's also turning into a more positive mode, but there's still an abundance of fossil fuels around for the next 100-200 years. At least in Europe, there are some barriers at the meso level. European energy policy is failing. although they come across now with an extremely ambitious sustainability plan in as a follow-up of the Green Deal. They call it Fit for 55, but the trade agreements do not really further the transition, and the basic laws and regulation also not. But this is a remarkable one, an intriguing one, a development lens. Most people see a transition as a kind of summing up of events, and that's not what happens in reality. So there are day-to-day changes people focus on. Well, more importantly are the changes from year to year, like market developments, liberalization, privatization. But most importantly are the structural development, the slow changes. So changes in demography, cultural shifts, power shifts. So those trends that creep into the system. And it's a combination of day-to-day change, year-to-year change, and decade-to-decade change. So if you would apply that to Corona, for instance, well, you may blame the Chinese markets, but that's way too superficial. Because of globalization, the virus could spread easily compared to 100 years ago, and it's also a part of our food chains. But most importantly, it is related to humans and animals and the relation we have with them, and the intensive livestock and our meat consumption behavior. So that is the deepest cause. We also spend a lot of time on analyzing patterns behind the transitions. It can be either a bottom-up pattern from arising niches, or a top-down, like you see in China. But what we see mostly is a hybrid pattern, that there are attempts to influence it from bottom-up and top-down. And in many examples, you see that in the food system, energy system, it's that mix that might make it successful. Well, this is what I showed you, the steering lens, starting from a vision, strategy, action and learning, and then go a couple of times through it. I call it organic planning. People think that transitions do not require planning, but even chaos requires planning. So you cannot direct them in terms of command and control, but we speak of organic planning with moving targets and continuously adjust everything that you are doing based on what you learn underway. And in terms of building up support, that is different from what you would normally expect. So it doesn't make too much sense to start with broad support. If you start a transition with a broad support, then you take the resistance on board. People who are, let's say, who have a cognitive dissonance attitude, they say yes and they do no. So we always start off with the willing and the able, less than 10%. So we call it the coalition of the willing and the able. That's crucial in order to get breakthroughs. And then step by step, try to broaden that support. If you don't do that, then the speed will be determined by the slowest and not by the fast. Why do we do that? Well, in general, if you analyze what happens in a population within a country, region, or a company, or whatever, 5 or 10% of the people can change and is willing to change. A quarter, these are rough estimates, but it's the order of magnitude that counts. 25% want to change but cannot. 25% can but do not want. And 40% cannot and is not willing to change. And this is a crucial group. If you get them on board, they will slow down the process. So I'm doing all kinds of projects within multinationals, for instance, like Shell. And I always start off with the smallest group, try to get a breakthrough, and then go to the second group. There's no guarantee that it will be successful, but if you do it the other way, I'm quite certain that it won't be successful at all. So the role of the government is crucial. In the first instance, they have an initiating and directing role, but later on in a transition, it's more taken over by business companies and also, let's say, NGOs and the ordinary people. So they get a more facilitating role. That means giving direction and providing space, connecting people, projects, parties, and so on. Oh yeah, this is a bit on scenarios on your request, if I'm correct, but we've done a lot of research into transition scenarios. This is a work of one of my PhDs. That means that there's various classifications of scenarios. This is one typology with 3 dimensions. Either scenarios are complex or simple, or they are explorative or policy preparation based, and or they are intuitively based or analytically based. And I think transformative scenarios or transition scenarios are explorative, analytical, and complex. So that's this part. That means they contain discontinuities. Many scenarios I've been developing within the IPCC do not contain discontinuities, no surprises, no bifurcations, always extrapolations of the current situation, and we know that that is wrong. So I'm in favor of creating counterintuitive results, also driven by a diversity of stakeholders, not only the usual suspects, but also those who have, let's say, counterintuitive ideas. Well, we've studied lots and lots of scenarios, and less than 5% of the existing scenarios are transformative. The current climate scenarios are pretty much boring. They're all business as usual. They all contain economic growth as a starting point. There was an interesting result from an Australian research group where they took degrowth as a starting point and see to what extent they could achieve the climate goals, and they could. So why not take degrowth? I'm not per se in favor of degrowth, but it's a different kind of reasoning, and that's also counterintuitive. Well, we should more include tipping points, physical and social. There's overly attention for physical tipping points. I've also been working on that. We know that the melting of the Greenland ice sheet and the Antarctic ice sheet, and then what will happen with the permafrost and boreal forest. That's very important, and that could easily accelerate the whole climate system. But this is also important, the social tipping points. Things like social norms that could be very influential in order to expedite the transition, protest, movement, social movement, laws and rules, knowledge. There was an interesting article by Otto and all earlier this year about social tipping point dynamics for stabilizing the Earth's climate. It was rather technical, and I was not too much impressed. It was typically done by natural science researchers, and I think it should be worked out more and elaborated on by social scientists. So what you can do is focus more on interventions from social tipping points. So can you set up a program in New Zealand that is trying to influence social norms by using social influences? Can you, let's say, stimulate protest and protest movement, starting lawsuits? We started with the very first lawsuit in the Netherlands in 2015 against the state of the Netherlands. That was done by Urgenda. I established that 15 years ago, and we won. And in higher appeal we won, and in the highest appeal we won again. And that has a lot of impact on other countries. Now there are hundreds and hundreds of lawsuits against companies, against states. In total, a lawyer counted in my country almost 2,000 climate lawsuits all over the globe now. So that is kind of the chaos we are in. Of course, education is very important to incorporate knowledge to influence younger people. Yeah, to round off, and then we can go into a dialogue. What is the role of scientists here? Well, For quite a long time, I have been in advisory board of important climate centers like in Potsdam, the Potsdam Climate Institute, or in England, the Tyndall Climate Center. And I always said we have more potential power than we are using of. Look at this funny picture. We are destroying the earth, and then politicians and government people say, could you kindly rephrase that in a more abstract way? Well, I mean, we urgently need scientists. I think that's a nice framing. I call myself a scientist. 10 years ago, I wrote an article in Sustainability on that. It's a synthesis of a scientist and an activist. I got a terrible biking accident almost 17 years ago. And then I realized I had virtually no impact on society, only in the scientific community, but that's at most 2,000 people. So after my biking accident, I said, well, I need to spread my knowledge more with a broader community. I was one of the few in the beginning. We established Urgenda in 2007. Nowadays, there might be thousands of scientists. Of course, there's always criticism that you need to be objective. You cannot be as a scientist and activist, but I think that's pretty much nonsense. If I guide my PhD, I'm not an activist, but I'm a pure scientist. But if I am in the public arena or in the media, then I use my activist mode. So all kind of actions that scientists can undertake. Distribute the real knowledge and the real story. We usually don't do that. There's a kind of chaos and disaster going on, but within the IPCC, it's always smoothed down and politicized. We can be a part of social movements that are arising all over the world. We can much more actively use social media. I'm quite active on Twitter, and that's still an exception as a scientist, and I really don't know why is that an exception, because okay, there's a lot of rubbish on the social media, but you can also use it in a more positive way and spread all your knowledge to broad people. We can be much more outspoken in the traditional media and do way more research on tipping points, in particular the social tipping point intervention. But to round off, collaboration with Drift. Drift is the Transition Research Institute in Europe. I think we can say that. We have about 40 scholars and researchers working. We do applied research, policy advice and consultancy. We do it in a multi and interdisciplinary way. And we have lots of collaborations within Europe. And we are looking for collaborations outside Europe. We try to establish a kind of sister institute in Australia alongside the eastern coast. So far not very successful, but perhaps, and we are also looking with interest to New Zealand. So, well, we are open for collaboration with you. Thank you very much for your attention, and I'm now open for the dialogue and any kind of question.
Great. Thank you, Jan. That was very stimulating indeed. Do you want to just change your share screen back so we can see you?
Yes, sorry.
Yeah, that's all good. Brilliant. So I'd like to invite any questions or comments back. Jan, your work really chimes well with the kind of work that I do, looking at the role of culture in sustainability. So when you're talking about social norms and practices, that's precisely the space I work in. So it's very interesting to hear that you're finding that these are incredibly important aspects of the transition, because that's certainly our work shows the same. So we've got one question here to start with. From Caroline Orkiston. She says the breakdown phase of your model is very interesting, and I wonder how this relates to legislation. For example, we have a suite of legislation that is no longer fit for purpose and currently undergoing major reform. How easy is it to dismantle legislation which is no longer relevant? Is it better to amend and revise or start from scratch? Your thoughts on that?
Good question. We did a kind of an inventory in the Netherlands 10 years ago. What kind of laws and rules were standing in the way of the neo circular economy? And we counted about 80 laws and rules that were standing in the way, and we had different classes of them. Some of them could be easily removed and solved, but some of them were fundamental. And we did it together with some ministries, the Ministry of Economic Affairs and the Ministry of the Environment at that time. And we removed 3/4 of them. Still, we are now being stuck with 20 laws that are still at odds with the new circular economy. An example, we have what we call, let's say, a waste law that prohibits you to reuse waste. And we created that 40 years ago because we considered waste as harmful for the environment. So for environmental reasons, that was a good law. But we were not aware of the fact that you could reuse waste in a circular manner. So, and that is now being addressed at the European level. So, because it's a European law. So the answer is yes. In 10 years, we removed successfully almost 3/4 of the, let's say, hindering laws. So yes, it's not easy. It will cost you years, but it's absolutely necessary. I can send you some material on what we have written about it and the 4 different classes of laws, but it's very important. But if you speak about social norms, people always say, well, I am willing to change, but the systems are against us, like the laws. So it's also very stimulating if you show people that you're formally working on breaking down barriers like laws.
Thank you. Great. Any other questions? Here's another question. I'm very interested in the place-based sustainable initiative, sustainable innovation initiative at the port. Can you tell us a little more about this, how they were set up and what the focus is?
Yes. Try to keep it short. This is a long-term process. So I started already 15 years ago. The point is, these port areas were in the hands of the port authority. They were the owner, and they were against transforming these areas into living neighborhoods. So that took us already quite a few years. That has changed now because most shipping activities are now along the coastline and not anymore at the center of the city. So that has helped. So first of all, the ground and the ownership moved from the port authority to the municipality. That was very stimulating. Secondly, we have created some examples that were catalysts for other port areas. People say, aha, it costs some money, but we had 2 successful examples, smaller parts, and that attracted already thousands of people. And we are now starting with the bigger areas, let's say hundreds of hectares. And my experience is to transform the former port area of Rotterdam into these new neighborhoods. That will cost us 30, 40 years. And so far, the first 15 years, we created only 20%. So the acceleration is still to come. So what we took, we again started with a very small group. Again, that small and deep support. And meanwhile, more and more people joined us. So we started with those coalitions of the willing and able, doing it neighborhood for neighborhood, learned a lot from failures. and there were quite a few. For instance, we wanted to start with building on the water, and there was no law for building on water. Who's the owner of the water? What were the building requirements? It took us 3 years before they created a law for building on water, for instance. That is what you find underway. And that is the reason why you need to be patient. So if you want to transform urban areas, it takes at least 1 generation, perhaps even 2. Try to be patient, celebrate your successes, small group starting, not a broad group, and extending it step by step, and use the right influences. So we had some influential people within the port and the municipality who were very supportive, and because it will cost millions and millions of euros in order to build that up, and it's public money, so you need to legitimize that on and on. And the support of these people, the influential people, was crucial in this process, because underway we've seen already 4 or 5 changes in the political arena. That changes every 4 years or even faster. So you need to depolitize the process also. If it comes into the hands of politicians and that is shifting, then it's turning into a high risk. So depolitizing is also very important. Well, there's way more to be said, but well, this is, I think, the core.
Thanks, Jan. We've got a couple of very different questions here. One from Rafe Chapman, who says, what's your thinking about moving away from price-based neoclassical economic thinking? It seems to have a very strong grip on thinking in New Zealand. How has the Netherlands managed this sort of change in thinking?
Yes, that's a long story. So how to keep this short? Well, the transition thinking is at odds with the neoclassical thinking. That, I hope that's clear for everybody here. So it's based on the long term and not the short term. It's based on, let's say, societal benefits and not only financial benefits. It's not price driven, but more, let's say, driven by other values. It was very stimulating for a group of people from the Netherlands to be in Bhutan. I've been there. There they have the national indication of happiness. So they steer on happiness. So they have the, rather than focusing on the gross domestic product, they focus on the gross happiness product. And we have now embraced in the Netherlands the so-called broad welfare index that contains about 40 different indicators, which go way beyond only the pure economic ones. So I'm a bit concerned if you still focus on the classical neoliberal values in New Zealand. That is a major barrier for the transitions that are coming to you. That is one of the biggest barriers I could imagine, because that is a way of thinking that is really, really, let's say, yeah, what is worse than barrier? I cannot even come up with in English, but it is a major hindrance. Yeah, because if you, and I've had those discussions even with Nobel Prize winners like Bill Nordhaus, if you calculate the pros and cons of a transition in terms of neoclassical value, you will never ever start with a transition. Because you know what the costs are, you don't know what the benefits are. So you would say, well, this is too risky. Well, then you will never resolve the climate problem. So, yeah. I hope you can help me out. That it is, you can say in Europe there's still a dominance, but it is breaking down now. Also because of the financial crisis that we have seen in 2008, and now also we are now facing the end of the neoliberalism. Even the Liberal Party in the Netherlands is now focusing on broader social values, because we've seen all over the failures of the market. So in Europe, the market thinking has crept into education, healthcare, in any kind of system, and they all turned into failures. And what you see in Corona during the crisis, that the government need to rescue the companies and need to rescue the people rather than the companies themselves. So people are more and more fed up with these companies and with the capitalists. You even saw that 2 weeks ago, when the biggest capitalists in the world went into space. People like Jeff Benson, and there was a lot of discomfort in my country and in other countries in Europe. People found it disgusting that people like Branson and Benson spent so much money on that kind of playground. So I think the tide is turning, and I hope that will take place also in New Zealand and Australia. But help me out, give me some indication. Why is it so deeply rooted still?
Can I follow up very briefly and just say, I think the focus on GDP and growing the economy has become a mantra that people just are stuck on. And so, you know, the government has been trying to shift towards a well-being focus, but it's very difficult for people to see that, you know, they see well-being as too abstract. And so they ask, well, what is the practical application of this well-being concept? You know, we're moving from a tangible notion like economic activity to a much more intangible concept like well-being, and that's hard for people to grip, I think.
Yeah, well, nicely formulated. I also noticed that in Australia, I've been there quite a few times, and I was wondering, how come, if you live so close to nature and with nature, and if nature is such a dominant part of your life, how can you embrace pure economic values rather than, well, the nature-based values? That is, for me, still a question that has not been addressed. That is, do you see what I mean?
Yeah, yeah. No, it's a quandary in Australia as well. I mean, when they suffer from bushfires and
yeah,
you know, the degradation of the environment, the salination of the soils, and yet, you know, this obsession with mining and economic expansion continues. Yeah.
I'm just aware we've just got a few minutes left and people will be needing to peel away to other work. Just before we end, yeah, and I think you've given us a lot of stimulating things to think about, particularly around collaborations for transition and the bringing together of different knowledge systems, different skills, bringing together of academic and political and business and community thinking into one space in order to try and stimulate a sensible